Hello, this is Ed Chapman, and this video cast is going to cover the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, which is primarily a difference in architecture. I'm quite sure everybody listening out there understands the word architecture. Okay, architects design plans for buildings. Well, evolution has designed plans for cells. Okay, so just as you build a house to have a certain shape, a certain size, and certain characteristics and whatnot, evolution has evolved different types of cells to exist in different places and do different things. So we're going to focus on this difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes as a difference in architecture, which I think is what it really is. All right, now at the most basic level, cells are containers. Okay, and all cells have the same minimum requirements for the construction or the architecture of these containers. Okay, the first thing you have to have is a semi-permeable cell membrane. And this is a skin, so to speak, that separates the inside of the cell from the outside. And we say that this skin is semi-permeable because it can control what enters and what exits the cell. It isn't like it just has holes in it where anything can go in and out. It is semi-permeable in the sense that it's selectively permeable. Some things can pass through and some things can't. The second thing all cells need to have is a cytoplasm filling the inside of the cell. Now the cytoplasm is made up mostly of water, so we can say it's a watery or aqueous cytoplasm. You may have seen this word already. Anytime you see something that is said to be aqueous, that means it's mostly water. And cells have to have DNA. DNA is the universal molecule for storing genetic information, and DNA is how this information travels through time. It's passed on from ancestors to their descendants, from everything from oak trees and humans to E. coli bacteria and fungi. And finally, the last thing, and I should have numbered this number 4. You never see these typos till you actually start doing it. Number 4, all cells need ribosomes. Ribosomes are these small RNA-based structures that are the machinery, so to speak, that cells use to build proteins out of amino acids. All right, so let's graphically represent this. Here is a cell membrane with a cytoplasm, which I've colored blue to represent the watery nature of it. Here is some DNA, which I drew as just kind of a line, a loop of deoxyribonucleic acid. And here are some ribosomes represented by these little spheres. All right. So cells have a cell membrane, or otherwise known as a plasma membrane. They have cytoplasm, which fills the inside. They have a loop of DNA. And they have ribosomes. So what we just talked about, just represented as a picture, same information. Some kinds of cells have another layer outside their cell membrane, which makes them a little bit stronger, called a cell wall. So here I've drawn that in and kind of using orange, okay? And there are some cells that have cell walls and some cells that don't have cell walls. Animal cells are famous for not having cell walls, but that kind of puts them in a minority. Most different types of cells do have cell walls. For example, plant cells, bacterial cells, and fungal cells all have a cell wall present. Now, this architecture, or this structure that we see here for this container, is basically what a bacterial cell looks like. All right? So here's a more bacterially drawn out cell. I don't want you guys to worry about what the different parts are right now, but I'm hoping you can see that we have a cell membrane here on the inside, a cell wall outside of that, watery cytoplasm in here, little ribosomes floating around, and a big loop of DNA. So basically, this is the same thing that we saw earlier in our simple architectural drawing of the most basic cell possible. This would be a more accurate drawing of a certain type of bacterial cell, for example, an E. coli cell. All right, and notice how simple this is. There are no internal containers or no additional compartments, for example, like a nucleus or mitochondria or anything like that. This kind of cell architecture is called prokaryotic, and cells that have this type of cell structure are called prokaryotes. Okay? Now, all cells on Earth share a prokaryote ancestor. They're considered to be the most primitive cells out there, and they've been around the longest. And this theory that prokaryotes were the first cells to evolve on Earth is supported by basically 3 different lines of evidence. Okay, the first line of evidence says that all cell membranes have the same phospholipid structure. So if you look at cell membranes from plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria, they're all built from a double layer of phospholipids. It's the same type of structure. Second line of evidence. All cells use DNA made from the same four nucleotides: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. This is true for all living cells on Earth, so they probably evolved from a common ancestor. And finally, it's the structure of ribosomes. All cells on Earth have the same basic structure for their ribosomes, and of course ribosomes are used to build all the proteins that cells need out of the amino acid building blocks, or monomers. So these are the three basic lines of evidence to support the theory that all cells on Earth evolved from a prokaryote ancestor. All right, now let's look and see how this happens. So sometime about 4 billion years ago, the original cell ancestor evolved on Earth. How this happened and where this happened, nobody knows for sure, but there are some pretty good theories. All right, we have descendants of these original cells alive today, and they're called archaebacteria. And these are the bacteria that live in really weird places, like in hot water inside of geysers, or in deep underwater crevices or vents where hot water is being spewed out. These are bacteria that live without oxygen, usually. They don't do photosynthesis, they do chemosynthesis instead. They usually die when you expose them to conditions that we need to live, like places where there are oxygen or at room temperature. Really weird bacteria because their metabolisms or their requirements for life are vastly different from most other cells. But they're considered to be very similar to the original cells. All right, now branching off of that bacterial line, we have the regular bacteria that are living inside your mouth and that are crawling around on doorknobs. These are the normal bacteria that most people talk about when they talk about microbes or germs. And then branching off of those are all the other types of cells that we have on Earth. And you probably recognize these as kingdoms: the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the fungi kingdom, and algae and protozoans combining to make something called the protist kingdom. All right, we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail later on in the year. But the point of this diagram, what I want you guys to remember, is that the original ancestor cell, okay, gave rise to basically two different groups of cell architectures: the prokaryotes, which are the bacteria and the archaebacteria, and the eukaryotes. Okay, and we'll talk about them in just a second. There is a basic dividing line between what I've circled here and what I've circled here. So let me show you what I mean. These types of cells, archaebacteria and bacteria, are prokaryotes. Remember, prokaryotes are cells that do not have compartments inside of the cell membrane. So they're missing things like a nucleus. All right, these types of cells are eukaryotes. Okay, now the word eukaryote right here means true cell. Okay, or they have a nucleus. So when you look inside of animal cells or plant cells or fungal cells or algae cells or protozoan cells, like Virchow and Schleiden and Schwann were doing, okay, they noticed that there are similarities here that put these types of cells in a different category, and that category are eukaryotes. The simplest way of looking at it is eukaryotes have a nucleus, so nucleus check. Prokaryotes, no nucleus. Okay, so that's the simplest way to think about this. Now, eukaryotes obviously are more complex than prokaryotes. They have compartments within the cell that hold and separate the machinery of life, or the cellular machinery. So they have compartments within compartments. Some of these compartments you probably heard about already. Okay, they are the nucleus, whose job is to hold and protect the DNA, the mitochondria, which contain all the enzymes or all the cellular machinery, so to speak, that are used to do metabolism to get energy out of food. And then there are the chloroplast compartments, which contain all the cellular machinery or all the enzymes needed to do photosynthesis. So eukaryotes are more complex because they have these compartments. Now, here are two pictures I got off of Google. Over here, we have so you can get my writing thing going here. This is a plant cell, okay? And notice plant cells have this extra green cell wall on the outside. This is an animal cell over here. And I'm not worried about you guys knowing all the names of all the different compartments right now, but what I want you to see is that there are compartments within the cell membrane. So for example, in this plant cell, we have a bluish compartment here and some greenish compartments here, and we have a nucleus, and we have all this stuff going on here. Same thing in the animal cell. We have the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, the main compartment, but inside that we have a nucleus, we have mitochondria, all these other compartments. So that makes these types of cells eukaryotes. So we can say that plant cells and animal cells have the eukaryote architectural model. All right, so notice here in a prokaryote cell, this is a bacterial cell, a bigger picture what we saw earlier, notice that there are no compartments, okay? There are no nuclei, no mitochondria, no chloroplasts in here, just ribosomes and a loop of DNA. Now, life on Earth isn't just about single cells. Cells have evolved the ability to live together and produce larger organisms. We call this multicellularity. So generally, the progression, the evolutionary process we follow here is we start with prokaryotes. Okay, then from prokaryotes we evolve eukaryotes, which are more complex. Okay, and then from single-celled eukaryotes we produce multicellular organisms. Okay, so you go from prokaryotes to eukaryotes to multicellular organisms. And as we move from here to here downward, we become more complex. All right? So the history of life on Earth has been a history of increasing complexity from prokaryotes to eukaryotes to multicellular organisms. Now, plants evolved from unicellular algae cells. Sorry about that. Okay, we start with unicellular cells, individual green cells that are getting along just fine. Okay, then we evolve multicellular algae, for example, algae cells that are arranged in a very simple way, for example, just a filament. If you look at this species of algae, this is a cell, this is a cell, this is a cell. This is a stringy filament of algae, okay? But this is more complex than single cells. And finally, we get true multicellular algae like seaweeds, okay, that have discernible or noticeable tissues, okay? A much higher level of organization. Until finally, the pinnacle, so to speak, or the most recently evolved, are the multicellular land plants. These are plants that are not only multicellular, but they are able to live on land, and they have tissues and organs like leaves and seeds and roots and stems and stuff like that. Much more complicated than seaweeds. Now, animals have evolved in a similar trajectory or a similar pathway. We start out with unicellular animal-like creatures called protozoans. All right. We then become simple colonial animals where we have individual cells living together and specializing in some way to become a larger organism. Until finally, we evolve true multicellular animals with tissues and organs that can live on land, like this family of bears here, multicellular animals. All right, thanks for listening, and that is the end of the video cast.